Hello, neighbor. In this video, we will discuss the importance of neighboring countries in both cases. Neighboring countries are important because they can be an enormous aid to refugees. While they can be an aid, they can also be a curse to the refugees, as will be seen in the case of the German expulsions. In the case of Syria, we will see the neighboring countries being enormous assets and aids to the refugees, particularly Jordan and Lebanon, who will be covered in more detail later for their critical roles in the resettlement and aid efforts. There are international organizations now that work with refugees in order to better protect them and in order to ensure that they have what they need. These international organizations play critical roles in the efforts today. However, in the past, they have been less effective, if they even existed. They aren't necessarily neighbors, per se. However, being international, they have no realistic bounds, ergo, they are being considered neighbors for this exercise. The multiple offices that offer aid and track numbers of refugees are primarily located within the UN, whose offices that effectively help and track refugee movements will be discussed later in this section as well. So with that, dear viewer, I leave you with the question of which do you think is going to be more important? Is it the neighboring countries, or is it the international organizations? Do both play an equally important role? Together, we will explore these questions, and in the end, all I will do is provide the facts. The good neighbors and the bad neighbors. To start, let us examine the case of the German people being expelled forcibly from their homes post-World War II. We've already mentioned Poland to some degree, but this will be examined further here as well as some of the other countries around the area such as Czechoslovakia and Slovenia. Starting with Slovenia, Volksdeutsche were rounded up in droves and forced onto cattle cars similar to the methods used by the Polish and Czech governments. The expulsions from Slovenia, however, as contrary to those in other nearby countries, were more illicit than anything. These expulsions were carried out primarily by partisans, not the traditional military forces, and their illicit nature came from the closure of borders by the Russian and Czech forces. In the cases of Slovenia, they found weaknesses in the borders and made an effort to bring expellees to those weak points to easily send them through. However, the ease of entry was not always the case, even in poorly guarded zones. Because of this, the Slovenian expellees were often turned back, whether in their cattle cars or even on foot. The Slovenians did not take no for an answer usually, and when expellees returned, particularly on foot, they would be shot more often than not. In one case, the Slovenian partisans rounded up an entire village and deported them by force, purely because the village was ethnic German. In Czechoslovakia, the situation was not quite as disorganized, however equivocally wild, during the period of wild expulsions, which were disorganized expulsions of the Volksdeutsche from their homes. The low figures for the estimates of expulsions from Czechoslovakia are about 800,000 to 1 million people. This is based purely off the ration cards handed out. With the number of people who were denied food and water, that raises questions of how realistic that number is. The expellees from this zone were commonly to the Soviet zones, and were used for forced labor in camps. They were commonly kept in concentration camps as well, until the authorities could determine what to do with them. The camps, while simply interim, were likened to the conditions seen by the Jewish population in the concentration camps under the Nazi regime, as were the conditions people returning from these camps and being expelled from their homes when they arrived at their final destinations. The Polish expulsions were perhaps the most extreme. When it came to numbers, with efforts to figure out the number of expellees from the reclaimed Polish territories being deemed futile efforts, the people being expelled from the Polish areas were distributed throughout the German territories. However, their treatment on the trains and in transit was commonly significantly worse than that of those being transported out of other zones. During the period of wild expulsions, people were shot, raped, deprived of food and water. They were commonly sent on cattle cars lacking food and water as well. The lack of humane treatment was rampant, and even with the atrocities that the Nazis committed, these were civilians, not soldiers in most cases. One British official noted that the appearance of the people getting off the trains reminded me of that of the Jews returning from the camps. There was a cattle car in Berlin station that was used as a mortuary. Every night, bodies were cleared off the car to make room for the next day's dead. In this portion of the video, the focus will turn to Syria, and specifically the neighboring states of Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, as well as the UNHCR, the international organization primarily involved in this crisis. First off, Turkey and the UNHCR are going to be covered much more in depth than Jordan and Lebanon here. IDPs are internally displaced people. First off, the UNHCR, or United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the importance of their role in the situation, as well as the importance of the data they are collecting. The UNHCR has multiple initiatives that they are working on to alleviate the suffering of the refugees from the Syrian crisis. The first of these is the Shelter Initiative, which seeks to provide adequate shelter to those in dire need of it. This initiative is primarily implemented by working with partners on the ground who are provided kits and implement them, building shelter for the refugees who need it. The aim of the Shelter Initiative is to enhance existing and potential shelter with the aim to decrease displacement and ensure that IDPs are able to return to their homes and enjoy their rights according to the international standards of HLP law. Focusing on 6 core areas of responses. 1. Responding to emergencies, providing life-saving, life-sustaining support. 2. Rehabilitation of public structures as collective shelters. 3. Upgrade of unfinished private buildings. 4. Owner/tenant-oriented shelter assistance to repair their premises. 5. Strengthen awareness of IDPs and host communities on housing land property rights through awareness sessions by legal aid partners. And 6. Enforce ongoing capacity building efforts to enhance the governmental response to the IDP crisis. This program has been relatively effective, as in 2017, it reached 482,342 displaced persons using various shelter solutions. However, with the number of refugees reaching in the millions, there is some room for improvement here. The next major program of the UN that this video will hone in on is the non-food items program. These items are typically things like mattresses, sheets, blankets, containers for water, cooking utensils, rubber boots, rechargeable fans, portable heaters, sleeping bags, and winter clothes for the harsh winters. Because of the cyclic nature of displacement, oftentimes the affected population will need repeat assistance and be issued more items as needed. This project is aimed to support IDPs and other affected population in need, with NFIs prioritizing the most vulnerable groups and people in hard-to-reach areas. Finally, for the UN, and really a brief section, is the important data that they provide. The UN tracks people who have been displaced externally to other countries, as well as those displaced internally. They also track those in need and those in dangerous combat areas who are non-combatants. This data helps us to understand what countries have been taking in their fair share of refugees, as well as helps to understand how many people need the assistance that the UN and other organizations can and do provide. Most importantly, it allows us to understand the sheer magnitude of the crisis, and understand that while there are ways to help, this is going to be a huge undertaking for the world for many years to come. Next is Turkey. And Turkey in this case has an interesting relationship with this issue. At first, Turkey had opened doors and was allowing refugees in. As of September 2015, there were nearly 2 million refugees in Turkey. Turkey has had a long history of being a land of asylum since its establishment in 1923. In 1979, Turkey adopted an open door policy, allowing people seeking asylum to enter without a visa and stay temporarily. This was in response to Iranians fleeing the new regime. From 1980 to 1991, a total of 1.5 million Iranians benefited from this policy. A similar event took place in 1991, during the Kurdish uprising, as 460,000 Iraqi refugees fled the country. Turkey granted them de facto refugee status, and did seek help from the international community to provide aid for these individuals. During the protests, because of Turkey's close relations with Syria, they did attempt to persuade Assad to take necessary steps towards government reform. We see just how effective that was, unfortunately. At first, Turkey adopted an open-door policy towards these refugees, as mentioned before, and they were considered guests rather than illegal refugees. This term, however, has no place in international refugee law. Because of this, Turkey did eventually create legal protections and give them official status. Starting from 2014, registration of refugees and an unofficial closed-door policy were adopted due to changes in Turkey's foreign policy towards the Syria crisis. The high number of displaced people crossing the border, lack of capacity of Turkey to respond to the needs of the influx, and the uncertainty about the expected time. The registration process here was particularly important because it gave these refugees access to given rights. Those who did not register did not have such access. Conclusions. As we have seen in this video, neighbors, international organizations, and policy are all extremely important when it comes to helping peoples who are displaced by military efforts. We have seen the effects of neighbors who are hostile and the detriment that can cause, as well as how a good neighbor can eventually be soured with too much influx and uncertainty. Capacity of neighbors to help, as well as harm, is important, as we have seen with the abilities of Turkey to take in refugees and adequately aid them, as well as has been seen in the extreme expulsions experienced by the German people from the Polish zones. International organizations can play an important role as well, both in provision of data and services to affected people. In conclusion, neighbors' views of the people who are displaced is extremely important, more so than international organizations, perhaps.